February 9, 1943, the frozen morning sky over northern France. At 22,000 feet, the air is thin, and the sound of engines tears through the cold silence like rolling thunder. 8 American fighters climb in tight formation, their silver fuselages glinting weakly under the pale winter sun. They are the new Republic P-47 Thunderbolts. Huge, heavy, and according to almost everyone who's seen them fly, hopelessly slow. Below, German radar operators mark their approach. One laughs. The Americans have sent refrigerators with wings. Another shrugs. Easy targets, he thinks, for the slim, graceful Messerschmitts waiting above the clouds. For months, Allied pilots had whispered the same doubts. The P-47 was unlike anything they'd flown before, 7 tons of steel and horsepower, armed to the teeth but clumsy in the air. Its nickname spread quickly, the Jug. To some, it was a joke. To others, a flying coffin. But in the cockpit of one of these so-called milk bottles sits Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, his hand steady on the control stick. The engine, a Pratt and Whitney R2800 double Wasp, growls beneath him, the sound deep and alive, like a living creature straining to break its leash. He knows the German fighters will come. He knows they'll dive out of the sun, fast, sleek, deadly. What they don't know is how much punishment this new beast can take, and how much fire it can give back. Over the radio, a calm voice cuts through the static. Bandits, 12 o'clock high. Johnson tightens his grip. The formation shudders. The horizon blurs into chaos, the white contrails twisting like veins across the sky. In seconds the laughter below will fade. The men who mock this machine will watch as it unleashes 8 streams of .50 caliber fury, a wall of lead that can shred a fighter to ribbons before the pilot can blink. The P-47's legend hasn't yet begun. But this morning, somewhere above the gray clouds of Europe, history is about to hear its first thunderclap. When the P-47 Thunderbolt entered combat in early 1943, few in Europe believed it could survive against the Luftwaffe's elite. It was the largest single-engine fighter the Allies had ever built, and, to most pilots, the most intimidating. At 7 tons, with a massive radial engine and a thick fuselage, it looked more like a flying oil drum than a fighter plane. It drank fuel like a bomber, handled like a brick, and when it first reached the skies over occupied France, it could barely keep pace with the German interceptors already waiting for it. But buried inside that steel monster was something the Luftwaffe hadn't yet faced, a machine designed not for elegance but for endurance. The origins of the Jug. The story of the Thunderbolt began years earlier, inside the offices of the Republic Aviation Corporation in Farmingdale, New York. There, engineer Alexander Kartveli, a refugee from war-torn Europe, was asked to build a fighter powerful enough to escort American bombers deep into enemy territory. Kartveli had one rule. If it is to survive, it must not be light, it must be strong. And so, in an age when speed and agility ruled the skies, he built the opposite. A brute force fighter powered by the massive Pratt and Whitney R2800, the most powerful engine ever mounted on a single-seat aircraft. It could climb to 30,000 feet, higher than most German fighters could even breathe. But it came at a price. Weight, drag, and the skepticism of almost every pilot who saw it for the first time. The mockery was relentless. British pilots nicknamed it the 7-ton milk bottle. Luftwaffe intelligence dismissed it as a mistake of American over-engineering. Even within the U.S. Army Air Forces, commanders wondered whether the Thunderbolt was too heavy, too complex, too late. But Republic's engineers kept building. And as the first squadrons arrived in England, something unexpected began to happen. First blood. April 8, 1943. The 56th Fighter Group, flying out of Horsham St. Faith, England, receives its first combat mission. Their task: escort B-17 bombers on a daylight raid over the French coast. The Luftwaffe is waiting. Dozens of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s rise from their airfields to intercept. 4 hours, the Germans had been mocking the new American fighter over the radio. "Tell your pilots," one taunted, "we'll send their milk bottles back in pieces." The first encounter does not go well. Several Thunderbolts are lost, some to enemy fire, others to mechanical failure. Pilots return to base shaken, their planes riddled with holes, but miraculously still in one piece. It was in that survival that the first clue appeared. While Spitfires and Mustangs often went down with a few bursts from a German cannon, the Thunderbolt could take punishment that defied belief. Engines hit. Wings shredded. Oil pouring over the canopy, yet somehow pilots limped home. One pilot later wrote in his diary, "I flew her back with half a wing and no hydraulics. She looked like she'd been hit by a train." but she got me home. The Thunderbolt wasn't nimble, but it was unkillable. By mid-1943, the Allies were learning fast. New tactics began to form, boom and zoom. The P-47's pilots realized they didn't need to outturn German fighters. They could use altitude, speed, and sheer firepower. The method was brutal and simple. Dive from high altitude at over 500 miles per hour, unleash all 8.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, and climb away before the enemy could react. Each Thunderbolt carried 3,400 rounds, enough to create what one German ace later described as a wall of lead that could cut a plane in half. One of those pilots was Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, a young man from Oklahoma with just a few months of combat experience. On June 26, 1943, during a mission over France, his squadron was ambushed by a swarm of FW-190s. Johnson's P-47 was hit over 200 times. His canopy was jammed shut, fuel pouring into the cockpit, controls failing. A German ace pulled alongside, signaled for him to bail out, then opened fire again, determined to finish the kill. But the Jug refused to die. Johnson made it back to England, half blind, half conscious, with a plane that looked like it had flown through hell itself. When ground crews counted the bullet holes, they stopped at 210. The Germans had learned a lesson. This was not a milk bottle. It was a fortress with wings. The evolution of thunder. Throughout late 1943, the P-47 underwent constant upgrades. The new paddle blade propeller increased climb rate by 500 feet per minute. Extended fuel tanks stretched its range deep into Germany. And the addition of bombs and rockets transformed it into a fearsome fighter bomber. The Luftwaffe, once laughing, now coined a new term, Jabo alarm. Whenever they heard the deep, rumbling engines of the Thunderbolts approaching low over the trees, panic spread across German ground units. Convoys scattered. Flak guns turned skyward. Thunderbolts would dive out of the clouds, dropping 500-pound bombs and firing high-velocity rockets, tearing apart tanks, trains, and anything that moved. In a single 6-month period, Thunderbolts destroyed more than 3,000 enemy aircraft in the air and tens of thousands of vehicles and locomotives on the ground. The laughter had stopped. Now, every German soldier in France learned to fear that sound, a distant roar that grew into a scream, followed by fire. The transformation wasn't just in the skies, it was in America's factories. In Long Island, New York, production lines worked day and night. By 1944, Republic Aviation was turning out a new Thunderbolt every 55 minutes. Women riveters and engineers, the Rosies of Farmingdale, became part of the war machine. Each rivet, each bolt, each polished canopy was a strike against tyranny. In total, 15,683 Thunderbolts rolled off the assembly lines, the largest number of any American fighter in history. Across the Atlantic, the Luftwaffe could only watch as its own resources dwindled. Where they crafted perfection in small numbers, the Americans unleashed unstoppable quantity. The Thunderbolt was proof of a new kind of warfare, industrial strength as a weapon. Dominance in the skies. By mid-1944, the Thunderbolt ruled the air. Newer fighters like the P-51 Mustang began to appear, faster and longer ranged, but the Jug still held its throne in the brutal, low-level war over Europe. Thunderbolt squadrons flew escort for B-17 and B-24 bombers, striking from 30,000 feet. At those altitudes, the German fighters' engines gasped for oxygen, while the Thunderbolt's turbo-supercharger kept it roaring. In countless duels, its 8 guns shredded Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs within seconds. German pilots soon learned to identify the Jug's thick silhouette, and to avoid it whenever possible. One Luftwaffe ace later admitted, "We made a terrible mistake. We laughed at it. We should have feared it." That fear had a sound, the deep, resonant growl of a double Wasp engine echoing through the clouds. A sound the Germans came to call simply, thunder. Legacy of fire. By war's end, the numbers spoke for themselves. Thunderbolts destroyed 3,752 enemy aircraft in aerial combat. On the ground, they obliterated 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives and 68,000 trucks. They flew in every theater, from Europe to the Pacific, and came home riddled with holes, covered in smoke and oil but still flying. Pilots who once feared it now swore by it. Mechanics called it indestructible. And when the war finally ended, the Germans who had once mocked it admitted the truth. The sky was never safe when the thunder came. Cinematic outro. The war that had begun in laughter, ended in silence. The same Luftwaffe aces who once mocked the Thunderbolt now scanned the skies with dread, searching for the glint of silver wings against the sun. By 1945, the flying milk bottle had become a storm. A storm of steel and fire that rolled across Europe, unstoppable, unbreakable, unforgiving. Its pilots, men who had once doubted it, spoke of the Jug with reverence. They remembered its weight, its sound, its sheer presence in the air. It didn't slice through clouds like a Spitfire. It pushed through them, a juggernaut wrapped in armor and fury. Every bullet hole, every scar in its thick skin told the same story. That survival, not elegance, was what won wars. In the archives of the 56th Fighter Group, there's a faded black and white photograph. 8 Thunderbolts in formation, battered, smoke trailing from one engine but holding the line. Underneath, a caption written in grease pencil reads, "Still here." That was the Thunderbolt's legacy. Not beauty, not grace, but endurance. When it first appeared, the experts had said it would never last. They said it was too heavy, too slow, too American. But history proved otherwise. Because what the Germans never understood, and what the Thunderbolt came to embody, was that America's strength wasn't in perfection. It was in persistence. In factories that never stopped. In engineers who refused to quit. And in pilots who climbed back into the cockpit, day after day, knowing that the Jug would always bring them home. As peace finally returned to the shattered skies of Europe, thousands of Thunderbolts sat silent on airfields, their engines cooling for the last time. Many were scrapped. Some were sold. A few became gate guardians, standing proudly at the entrances of old bases, reminders of the storm they once carried. But for those who flew her, the sound of that great engine never truly faded. Even decades later, veterans could close their eyes and hear it again, the deep, rolling thunder of the double Wasp, echoing across time. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was more than just a fighter. It was a lesson, carved into metal and written in fire, that in war strength takes many forms. Sometimes it's speed. Sometimes it's precision. But sometimes, it's the sheer will to keep flying when everything around you is falling apart. The Germans laughed at it once. They never laughed again. Because when the sky turned gray and the sound of thunder rolled across Europe, every man who looked up knew exactly what was coming. And it wasn't the weather. It was the Thunderbolt. The Jug. The fighter that refused to die. Fade out. The screen darkens. Faint echoes of distant engines rumble in the background. On screen, dedicated to the men of the 56th Fighter Group and all who flew the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt.